All right. Uh, First off, did any of you have any trouble finding the recording from last week's session if you wanted to look at it? I mean, did you check the YouTube link or anything like that? Uh, YouTube, they've changed the recording posting protocols a little bit. So I, I know I could see it. I just wanted to make sure that it was truly an open link. Uh, with all the questions about social media and privacy and you know being able to protect people's identities and things like that. Now you have to identify when you get ready to put something up on YouTube. You have to identify the audience and whether it's you have to make sure you check that it's not for kids because if you check that it's for kids, then you got another 3-page electronic form to fill out. So there's a lot of changes they've made. Slows it down a little bit, but I think it's probably works pretty well. You know. Uh, Now we need to talk a little bit about one of the constant sort of struggles in higher ed uh, is this question of what is the purpose of higher ed institutions, or even in a broader sense, what's the purpose of learning? And we've been kind of schizophrenic about that for an awfully long time, and it really kind of the discussion changes terminology a little bit, but never really goes away. Um, Back in the turn of the 20th century, uh, we talked about something being vocational versus something being a humanities, and that was pretty much what we talked about. And humanities were like literature and dead languages and art and all those things. The vocational was math and science and engineering and anything having to do with with data and machines or professional careers or whatever. Those were all considered to be vocational. So it was kind of humanities versus vocational, and then as we got into the 20th century, moved on, it became more about uh, liberal arts or liberal learning versus uh, career preparation or professional learning. And so, do you go to school to become a better thinker, or do you go to school to get the content you need to become a lawyer, to become a doctor, or to go to professional school, or go to an engineering school, or whatever? And so it's kind of this debate has gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it it's got a lot of things that it's related to, but some of which we can probably identify, some of which we can't. And so I have a fairly simple question to ask you, and I'm going to share this up if I can find the share thingy. Oh, that's not it. Where'd it go? There it is. Um, Grab my little visualizer here. Uh, Neatest little trick they ever made for uh, distance ed and online learning is these little tiny little dot cam like things. Uh, Man, they work like a jewel. But I have a question for you. First, most undergraduate degrees have a total hours of about 120 credits, give or take. You won't find many that are less than 120. You might find some that are 124, 26, maybe even up to 130. But the federal guidelines on that in terms of providing financial aid and stuff like that identifies 120 as the target, as the max. So if you have programs that are 130 or 126 or whatever, you're a little bit out of alignment with the financial aid standards and things like that. So most institutions try to get to 120. At a 2-year school, associate degrees, anywhere from 30 to 36 hours. Once again, there's a bit of a debate about, um, what's the optimal, whether it's 30 hours or 36 hours, or I've even been seeing them up to 40. But it's probably not, doesn't vary a lot from 36 or so. The applied associate degrees, a little bit more sometimes because they may have more content courses. But the total hours is generally for regular associate degrees, probably about 36 or so, somewhere in that range. No, that's not right. What am I saying? 36, 72. Or I made a mistake already. Oh well. This is really kind of a yearly thing. So it's 36 per year. So associate degree is 2 years. It's about 70 to 72. Sometimes it's lower than that. Sometimes it's higher. No, 72 is about the max. I've seen them as low as 62, 64, somewhere in that range. Maybe even a couple that are at 60. But typically they're 70, 72, somewhere along there. Yeah. I have a simple question. Of those hours, what percent should be liberal arts, gen ed, if you want to call it that? Once again, we've gone back and forth on names and structures and whether they're actual courses or whether they're themes or whether they're, all kinds of things that we play with. Dimensions. We went through a phase when I was at JMU where we talked about dimensions in undergraduate gen ed pieces, and I never quite understood what that meant, but we just cross-related the courses to them, so we just still taught courses, but supposedly they were dimensions. And what percent of content? Now, some of the accrediting agencies, bodies get involved. College of Business, AASCB, is that what it's called? Associated CSB, AA, American Association of Collegiate Schools of Business. Their accreditation standards, which is the big time stuff for them, is 50%. So they've got 60 hours of content, and they have to take at least 50% of their coursework outside of the College of Business. And that's typically the gen ed, liberal arts, whatever. In education, the NCAPE, CAPE, all that now, we used to have a standard that said you couldn't have more than about 70 hours of education, practicum, content, all that sort of stuff. Finally, it got whittled back down to about 60 hours. And so we were at pretty much the same thing, about 50% of coursework in the college of education, another 50% someplace else. And people play games with this. They get courses designed to go into liberal arts that might really serve a content purpose, but that's over there, so they can count it in different places. But in your mind, what is the optimum level? Percentage-wise.
Yeah, I would say probably 40 to 50%. Obviously, depending on what your major is. If you're an engineering major, you probably can't do that. Some of the hard science stuff, but yeah, I think that's a good figure.
40, 50, somewhere in that range for liberal arts.
And it's hard to find that balance, because if you're talking to college freshmen and sophomores who are sitting in all their gen ed liberal arts classes and they're dying to start majors coursework, you kind of start getting feedback that they're taking courses that maybe aren't meaningful to them, or it's not tied. So it's hard to find that balance, because I do think liberal arts background's important, because say you go out and you work the job you trained for and you decide you don't like it, you need skills to switch. But I think when we start looking at the business part of education, sometimes it can be hard to get students to buy into 50% of liberal arts coursework, especially when that's the front end of their program and that's what they're getting to do.
Yeah, that's the kicker a lot these days, is that, you know, it is the way we've built that structure. We put it on the front end because it's theoretically supposed to make them a better thinker, but the courses are not, sometimes not terribly exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's you know, overlaps a lot of content that maybe they've experienced before, maybe not at this level, but you know, content they've experienced before.
And they also tend to be the larger classes too. So
Yeah.
if you're someone who struggles in 300-person lecture halls, but you know once you get to your major it's going to be smaller, I think it becomes a weeding out factor almost too soon.
Yeah, and you know, there's some evidence, and when you kind of look at the empirical sort of notions, there's some evidence that people typically have a lower GPA in their liberal arts coursework than they do in their content coursework. Now, part of that may be because content coursework folks, I mean, we tend to inflate the grades a little bit because, you know, you want to make them competitive once you get out, you know, go beyond in sort of the job environment. But there is that element that you talked about. The latest research tells us that that students come through college right now are going to change careers 5 times in their working life. Now, their working life may be extended a little bit longer because they're living longer, and you know, all of us old aging baby boomers need them to work a lot longer. But you know, you know, they'll change careers maybe 5 times on average. Used to be that they changed majors a lot and then didn't change careers too much once they got out there.
And that's what that one article we read today, or for today, was talking about, was the change of the focus away from liberal arts into more professional.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think we're setting students up to not be successful in life when we focus on the professional, and then you get out and maybe work in that field for a short time and then go, yeah, that's not what I thought it was. And you decide to move on, and you don't necessarily have as diverse of a skill set to support it.
Yeah, it's one of those, you know, as you say, it's a dilemma. It's a bit of a dilemma because we know that done right, liberal arts coursework um, can challenge kids and students to think. Not when it's just done as a, you know, 300 people in a course and you learn, you know, a few facts and figures and take multiple choice tests for exams and assessments and stuff like that. But you know what, if they're done right, they can challenge people to think. I once was involved at JMU. We decided we weren't real fond of the students that were coming in. Okay, we weren't saying they were stupid. Okay, we were just had grown less fond of the freshmen coming in because they all tended to have sort of this, you know, professional career focus. They all came from, you know, upper income families. Very few. We're getting more and more and more and more upper income families. It's also happening at App State right now. The household income of students coming to App State right now is the highest average in the UNC system. And so, you know, it gets a little depressing when you're driving a Prius or a Honda or something, all your students are driving Mercedes and Audis and that sort of stuff. But, you know, hey, I'm the one giving the grades, so I can mess with them. But Yeah, I mean, we were unhappy at JMU with what we were seeing because we were getting kids that coming in as freshmen and they knew everything. They had it all, and the particularly for the folks that were teaching the gen ed pieces in the first 2 years, which are trying to create thought process and all like that. And so we had a grant, we got a grant, and or I got a grant and convinced the university that let's try this. And we had enough money in the grant to pay for about 24 sections a semester, and we recruited senior faculty. We didn't use junior faculty. We recruited senior faculty around the institution, and we called it freshman seminar. And we based it around a lot of humanities text and economic theory stuff and political theory stuff, and it was basically great books sort of things. We had them reading Rousseau and Plato. I mean, we're all over the board with this thing. And but it was we limited the sections to 17 students, and we only used classrooms that allowed us to set them and do the kind of the Socratic methodology, and put everything in a circle, and where you could see everybody else in the class, and have the discussion that way. And as the instructors, we would create prompts and just kind of get out of the way. And the only thing we demanded was their participation and interaction with each other. And so if somebody wasn't talking or whatever, after a while, I'd call on and say, hey, what do you think? Joe, what do you think? What are your thoughts about this? And when we started getting feedback from students, it was interesting, really, really interesting. We had roughly, it was one of those sort of binary distributions, bimodal distributions, where we had about half of them at one end, about half the other end. And when you look at their comment pieces, about half of them said it was the most exciting educational experience they'd ever had. They really enjoyed the discussion. They enjoyed the fact they had to think and all that sort of stuff. And the other half basically said, why am I wasting my time doing this stuff? I could be taking an economics class, or I could be taking an anatomy class, or I could be taking, and so the university, after putting up with us for a couple of years until the grant began to wear out, they shut us down after a couple of years because how did you justify it when half your students were so pissed off they couldn't see straight, and the other half were so elated over the experience they were having that we had to kind of wean them off of it, a little bit at a time. But it was, it was that conundrum once again. I mean, you do have students that are coming in, and parents that are sending their kids with different purposes, different focus, and unfortunately, whether you like it or not, your children eventually adopt a lot of you, and so they were coming from high success families, that were successful in business and professional environments and things like that, and so they wanted to be too. I mean, that was kind of where they were going with things. So it was, that was a real lesson for the institution there, was to kind of think through this process of what do you do with kids. And then we thought about splitting up liberal arts, and doing part of it as capstone experiences at the end, particularly the stuff on ethics and things like that. We always had an ethic component to it, and the ethics pieces, we thought about putting that on the end, along with some synthesis capstone sort of experience, creative experience. And the departments went ballistic on that one. We tried that for a couple of years, and it worked pretty well. It's just that some of the senior faculty in different content areas were now teaching junior level classes because that content had got bumped down to the junior level, as opposed to all senior level classes. And that offended their self-worth and their vanity. I'm sorry, I'm too harsh there. At least their self-worth. But they, so they were going to teach juniors. They were going to teach only seniors. I mean, those are some of the comments we got. So, we tried that, and that didn't pan out over the long term. The students typically loved it. Faculty and departments didn't care for it too much. So after a couple of years of that, we kind of gave up on trying to, modernize gen ed or liberal studies or whatever. And we're still stuck with the fact that all these professional programs, pre-professional programs, required 50% of the content to be in gen ed. So even though those programs didn't want really to participate in it all that much and didn't want it to, kind of eat into their time, they knew they had to have it. They just didn't, they just kind of wrote it off too. It's just something kids have got to get through. So how does that change with the associate degree though? Particularly the transfer associate degrees.
That was going to be my question. Which one were we talking about? Because it transfer is like all gen eds pretty much.
Yeah, it's all gen ed.
That's a handful.
Maybe 100%.
Yeah.
90%, with some, how to learn classes and how to fit into college and stuff like that. But yeah, it can, the typical sort of structures we get into is we get about, 40, 50%. Most of the time it's closer to 50, probably at the undergraduate level. And, 95 to 100% of the particularly transfer. Now, applied arts, it may be a very small amount. It may be 25%, something like that. But the associate transfer degrees, it's almost all of it. And so, that changes the structure at the four-year level because these transfer kids are coming in with their liberal arts piece in hand and moving right into content, pre-professional, professional content stuff. But are they ready? Is this down here equivalent to that there? I mean, is that now we're in a qualitative focus. I'm not bad mouthing community colleges or two-year schools or anything. We're just strictly entering into a qualitative focus. Is what students getting down here, equivalent to what they would get here?
I think it depends on the institution that they're coming from.
Probably. What would make it different?
Between institutions or between the community?
A 2-year and a 4-year. What would make that different between a 2-year and a 4-year?
It's the critical thinking piece. I think just maybe I'm totally wrong, but I just think that the discussions and the rigor would be most likely different, but perhaps that is the quality of the institution, because just like universities are different, community colleges are also different. So perhaps the rigor and the quality of the institutions would be the same as, I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps. What makes?
And Julie, I think just said she thinks the community college, I guess, is better because they're smaller.
I would also say the environment.
Yeah.
Community college classes tend to be smaller, but that doesn't always equal greater quality. But I think the environment overall, the campus environment and the environment of the instructor and the classes, I think that makes a big difference as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's a question. It's a legitimate question because it's a question that gets asked, not directly, but it get asked in lots of ways. I used to do a lot of work with grants to try to do you know, kind of their articulation agreement idea, that we would look at, you know, programs and degree programs and things like that at the community college and try to get, you know, 4 institutions to articulate them into the community college. But because of accreditation standards, it was almost always what we had to work with at the community college was the transfer associate degree transfer degree. When what we would have preferred to work with in some cases was the applied arts degree, particularly in the sciences and pre-engineering and things like that, because, you know, they could get some content stuff out of the way at the community college level and then not have to take all their gen ed stuff at the community college level and take some of it at the 4-year institution level. And so there was a, you know, the debate, once again, I don't have an answer. I don't have really a strong sentiment one way or the other, but I know it's a debate that takes place. You know, or is gen ed and liberal arts down here equivalent to up here in a qualitative sense? And I think you bring up good points. I mean, it's some of it's contextual and some of it's you know, just differences in institutions and differences in approaches. And you know, 4-year institutions are much less friendly places than 2-year institutions typically, because they typically are a little just bigger and a little bit more anonymity at 4-year institutions. I mean, you, as a parent, you'd like to think that they're really worried about your kid, and as it turns out, they probably care less in some regards because they're just one of, you know, 20,000, and that's overly critical, I'm sure. But from a student's perspective, that's not overly critical because that's how some of them feel. You know, that they're earlier in the first half of the thing, I noticed somebody made the comment about teachers feeling disrespected or teachers not feeling respected. Well, when you know, if you're a kid, particularly from a, you know, smaller school setting or a smaller area and rural area or whatever, and you have maybe, you know, some self-confidence issues to begin with, you throw that kid into a 20 or 25,000 student institution, and without dealing with their sort of insecurities and all, then, you know, that could be you know, a recipe for failure too. So, I mean, there's lots of reasons why, you know, students might make that transfer. Economics, you know, community colleges are always cheaper, though that's beginning to be a little bit more of a problem too. They're not as cheap as they used to be. Financial aid money is not as prevalent at 2-year schools as it is to 4-year schools, and it's limited to some grant programs and things like that. But it's I don't know, this notion of what schools ought to be doing. This really doesn't even have to do with that. This has to do with how we structure schools to try to do both. And some of the article that you looked at talked about making decisions to do one or the other.
Can I add in that if you look at the it's designed to be the same, and I agree that there could be a lot of variation between schools and instructors. But when you look at the state level, at North Carolina state level, the statistics for the students who have completed their transfer degree and their GPA when they're at university, as a group, those transfer students have a higher GPA overall than the students who started out at university and are in their last 2 years of university work. So when you look at those two groups, the transfer students are slightly higher than the ones that had started out at university. I think that's interesting.
It is interesting, you know, what one critique you'll hear of that. It's because community college grades easier.
This is after they reach university.
Right.
That the GPAs after everyone's in university, so they're like their last 2 years.
Yeah, I wasn't saying it as a critique. I was saying that they are used to being successful. Universities programs, you know, once again, one of my 14,000 stories. At one point, I'm also a statistician, so I teach stats and research methods and all that good stuff. But as a statistician, at one time when I was at JMU, I was half-time in the College of Education, half-time in the School of Psychology. In the School of Psychology, I taught their beginning stats course and then research methods course, those two beginning courses. And they would have, and those were the barrier courses. You had to get through those two courses successfully to get into the program. And why did they need barrier courses? Is because in an institution of at that time about 15,000 students, they had 1,500 majors. And they had over 2,000 students, or well over 2,000 students that would try to enter each, you know, that had tried to get in. And, you know, it eventually, you know, maybe 500 a year, 700 a year. And they needed to cut that down to no more than 500 a year. And so we were using, you know, the stats course and the research methods course as sort of the barrier courses. And they had to get through those before they could be considered for admission to the degree, to the program. And so the thought was that stats would be the primary barrier course. And we would be very, and they couched the language very interesting. They said we would display excessive rigor in that course. Basically, they wanted us to fail some kids because anything below a C, you couldn't get into the major. You got 2 shots at it. Well, one of my strengths in teaching undergraduate had always been stats. And I taught it from a logical perspective and didn't approach it strictly from a mathematics formula sort of perspective and things like that. And so people, you know, kids got it. And when we got to the final, there was a common final exam. When we got to the common final exam for the stats course, you know, if I had 2 sections of students out of the 20 some offered, my 2 sections always had the highest scores on the exit exam. And almost very seldom did I fail anybody because, you know, I'd take it on myself. If somebody was having difficulty, I'd make sure they came by and see me, and, you know, we sat down together and stuff like that. And if they didn't, then you know, those were the ones that failed. But I could get them through the course. I could get them to understand stats well enough to do well on that exit exam. Well, after a couple of semesters of that, the department head called me in and he said, "Well, what are you trying to do with the stats course?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to teach students statistics." He said, "Well, yeah, that's important, but we really need you to fail more students. We need each section to fail about 5 students, 5 to 10 students." We had 25 in a section. I said, "Well, you know, that's kind of in Congress with why I'm here. You know, I think I'm supposed to be an instructor and I'm supposed to do the best I can to get these students to learn and understand this thing I'm supposed to be teaching them." And so I think it would be inappropriate for me simply to say I'm going to fail 5 to 10 students just because, you know, your program's getting too big. And we went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So finally, I walked out, and that was the end of that. Except next semester, I didn't teach any stats courses. I taught nothing but research methods courses. And I didn't fail anybody in there either. So because I could get them through that. But, you know, it was this difference between the perspective of what needed to happen in those courses versus what instructors might be willing to do. And so, you know, lots of times you kind of get into these things and you know, I wanted them to come out of it with a pretty good self-confident notion about them in statistics. At least they could understand it well enough to, you know, interpret things and things like that. Maybe they couldn't do it all the time, understand exactly what you did with certain things, but in general they could. And they could understand how to interpret it and what it meant and all that sort of stuff. And that's why, yeah, that's how I got into the course. But it was not what the department wanted me to do. They wanted me to fail 5 to 10 students a semester. And I was just unwilling to do that. And so they put me in another place where I couldn't do as much damage because they took the research methods course second. And if they failed the stats course, they couldn't take the research methods course. So it was, you know, what you get into sometimes is self-confidence. And I think community colleges and 2-year schools do a much better job trying to build self-confidence. Because with open admission, some of the students coming in are not the most confident kids in the world. And they're not the most accomplished students in the world. And part of that is that kind of plays together, that ability to do things and the self-confidence. So I do think that it's likely they'll do better than they would otherwise when they get to a 4-year school, because if they can get through that transfer, associate degree programs, and do well with it or whatever, the way community colleges are structured, they're a little bit better shot at being feeling a little bit better about themselves. And student services at community college level is typically a whole lot different than student services at the university level. At the university level, student service is a lot focused around building their social awareness and helping them socially fit into the institution. So at the 2-year level, it's a lot different. But this is an ongoing debate here of, you know, are these two things equivalent? And if they are, then for lots of students, this is a better way to go. But even the bigger question is the nature of the institution itself. Should we have at the higher ed level, should we be focusing at say a comprehensive university like App State or like JMU or like, you know, any 1,000 other comprehensive institutions? Should our focus be on professional preparation or pre-professional preparation, or should our focus be on liberal arts, which is a little bit more of developing the thinking skills? I mean, if we have to think about tilting the scale one way or the other, which way do we tilt the scale?
My gut reaction would be to say toward liberal arts, but now you have so many more, we need trades again. We need people in the trades. So there's that balance of what society needs as well.
Yeah, I mean, and there are, you know, there are lots and lots and lots of programs that have been designed over the last 5 or 10 years that support people career switching and going into more technical areas. Because I mentioned that number earlier, the 15 to 20 million people that are technically unemployed. They may have a job, but they're technically unemployed. And they'll never work at the level that they had before they were, you know, moved out for whatever reason, whether it was a industry change or technology or automation or whatever. At some point they were moved out and they'll never work again, like all the textile people in the South and furniture people in North Carolina and different places in Georgia and North Carolina. And so they're just places, and the coal miners in West Virginia and all those ancillary sorts of thoughts, and the coal miners in Kentucky, and some of the farmers. I think I read a report today in Minnesota, 300 dairy farms shut down this year alone in Minnesota alone, with the total number of people laid out of work somewhere around 8 to 10,000 on 300 dairy farms. And so, these structural forces are there. And what high school used to be able to do was prepare people to go into the workforce, where they could work for 30 or 40 years and make a good living and, buy a nice house and send their kids to college and have a boat and, whatever. They don't exist anymore. And so it's, the things that we talk about today is technology. The new skill sets are very, very technologically based. If they don't have a very good preparation in gen ed, or a very good preparation coming out of high school that they came out of 25 or 30 years ago, they're not strong in math and not strong in science, is it likely that they will become productive again at the level they were before? And not with the programs we have now. That's my contention, not with the programs we have now. That we got to figure out, better ways to do it. And we have to, maybe we don't need another few thousand literature and history majors. I don't know. Or maybe we don't need another few thousand MBA people, or what. I don't know. But it is a question that school administrators and management and boards will have to sort out, because right now it's not working. And anytime something's not working, it eventually has to change. Either it does it kicking or screaming, or it does it on its own. And doing it on its own is always a better way to go. But are we at that point? Or do you see it in the institutions you work in? Do you see these pressures that are happening? None of you look like you have the option of just retiring again. I do. So, I've tried it twice. It didn't stick. So, if I do it again, it's probably it. I mean, but I mean, these are the debates of our time in terms of higher ed. Is what do we do? I mean, what's our focus? What's our primary focus? What do we do with people? The number of people we need for doctors and lawyers and accountants and folks like that, pretty much relatively about the same percentage that it was in the 1920s, 1930s. Now, because there's more people, it's a bigger number, but relatively speaking, it's about the same percentage.
Well, I think part of the issue is you mentioned back that high school was supposed to get you to join the workforce. And at this point, high school is no longer that. When you exit high school, you're not quite ready to enter with an entry-level job anywhere. You have to go on to some additional training, whether it's VOTEC, whether it's community college, whether it's military, whether it's a four-year college. And so as times have evolved and education has slid back in some areas, our students are losing that ability to leave high school and go into an entry-level job that's not customer service or restaurant. And then we just, like, I was thinking as you had asked about whether or not we should go more liberal arts or content. And liberal arts is kind of where that area is where we can learn more of the critical thinking, the math, strengthen some of the math skills, all of those things. Because even some of us in class now may end up working in jobs that don't exist yet. And definitely students that are in college, we're preparing them for a career that's now, but in 10, 15, 20 years, are they ready for careers, and do they have those foundation skills to adapt for careers that don't even exist yet?
Yeah, I used to tell when I was working with teaching candidates, undergraduate, and we had a 5-year program at JMU, so we had them in a graduate year too. But when I was working with those kids, here I am calling them kids again. They're 22, 23, 24. They're kids. But when I was working with those kids, they, we gave them everything we could give them. We gave them assessment skills. We gave them diversity skills. We gave them differentiation skills. We gave them, we gave them everything we could give them. And the last question I would ask them when they were last day of class I had before they graduated, and I had one of the last classes they took, a capstone class, a seminar class. The last question I ask them is okay, now what are you going to do? What are you going to learn next to stay current? And they'd be like, well, God, we're done, aren't we? Or, we're graduating, aren't we? Or I said, yeah, but the minute you walk across that stage, you're obsolete. You are obsolete. Now you're pretty skilled and you're functional, but some of the stuff that you got from us and you got from your cooperating teachers and all like that sort of stuff is probably obsolete by the time you get to implement it. And so where's this lifelong learning thing? And I would make them sit down and write, do a little reflection paper about lifelong learning and what they need to learn next, and where were they going to get it, and how were they going about doing it, and all those sorts of things. Because it truly is, the minute that you think you've concluded your learning process, they might as well throw the dirt on you, because you're not going to be terribly useful that much longer. And I say that even with myself. I've done postdoctoral stuff in the last 4 or 5 years that after my first retirement that I probably would not have done, except for the fact that I wasn't ready to quit doing this thing yet. But I knew I needed to learn some new skills, pick up a few new skills, technical skills. And I'm scheduled to do a couple of things this year. And so you just got to keep, that's the thing. And does that fit the structure we now have in higher education? And that's the question that you have to answer, that you have to think through, because you're the ones that are going to be out there. Are you ready? I mean, are you ready to make kind of those calls, those decisions? Because those are the type of things that'll come at you. They'll come at you in little ways. You won't be making the big decision. You'll be making all the little ways that the big decision gets implemented. But you can never lose track of the big thing, the big questions, because all these little answers that we end up having to come up with are just part of the big one. Thinking makes your head hurt, That's kind of what it's supposed to do. Confusion is a good state to learn from. You know who said that? Einstein. One of his famous quotes is, confusion is a good state to learn from. And so he always, he was very much about, finding a problem that he was confused about and then trying to solve it. And he was a lousy mathematician. He couldn't do the math at the level of his theoretical stuff. But, he would come up with stuff, and then the mathematicians later would figure out, well, yeah, he was right. But he couldn't do the math himself. He wasn't that proficient at truly high level math. But so he always worked with a mathematician, was always who he tried to get as a partner. Somebody that could help him figure it out. I knew you wanted to know that just in case that came up in Final Jeopardy someday. But all right. It is 8:17. We've done about 2 hours worth of stuff. I'm a little tired. You're a little tired. I can sleep in tomorrow. You got to get up and go to work. So just, you know, what can I say, you know? If in the middle of class I ever get sleepy, there's a little day bed over here in my office. So, you know, I can always kind of crash while y'all are cogitating over something. But we'll see how that works. All right, folks. Big things tonight. Two big things. One is this notion of theoretical perspectives. I would encourage you to go back and read in more detail. You know, the kind of the outcomes of taking a positivist versus a constructivist versus a postmodernist theoretical perspective, and what that means in terms of decision making and what that means in terms of institutions. Because we're going to, one of your assignments coming up is to kind of through that lens, those different theoretical lens, you know, look at a case or an institution and think about how, you know, what sort of perspective they're coming from, or what that might look like. Also, between now and next week, I'm going to kind of arbitrarily put you in oh, I think there are 13 people in here when everybody's here, so I'm probably going to put you in probably 3 groups, four groups, 3 of those are 3 and 1 of 4, something like that. And because one of the assignments coming up down the road is a group piece. And you can also run drafts of things by your group. And so we'll create a group structure, and as you learn, we'll create a group structure in the Zoom thing here. We can create individual group rooms, and so we'll give you a place to work with. But it's, you know, it is the only real way to think about coming to some terms with some of these notions, some of these dilemmas that are out there, is to think about it as a community thought process. Because nobody ever has, you know, you're never the smartest in the room, but you're certainly never the dumbest in the room. And so if you can, you know, that's the hardest lesson for an academic to learn. That, you know, when you walk into a room, you have to understand there's always somebody smarter than you there, probably several. And there's probably also somebody there that's not quite, as I mentioned earlier, cornbread's not quite done in the middle. And so you can kind of find a way to maneuver. But the, you know, the discussion process, that's the collaborative process. That's the important thing these days in terms of arriving at compromises. Because you don't necessarily get solutions, you get compromises these days. And compromises are good. They're okay. They get you down the road a bit, and then you can deal with another compromise from that perspective, from that position. So next week, we're going to try to put a little bit more context around higher education. We're also going to try to put some definition around typical organizational structures. And so we'll step back from higher ed a little bit and look at typical organizational structures. And so the readings next week are kind of focused around that. And I'll get the Best Indeed chapter 6. It's not quite up. It's not up yet. It'll be up either later tonight or first thing in the morning. And so there'll all 3 be there. The Manning one's up. The 2 or 3 little short readings on Mintzberg is up because Mintzberg is kind of the godfather of organizational structures. in the 20th century. And most of his work was done with industrial thought processes, but kind of later in his career, he began to look at social science structures, and in particular educational structures, and think about, how does some of that theory apply? And then there's some pushback against him on a couple of other little short pieces. So it should all be up there by tomorrow. And we'll keep coming back to some of these readings a little bit. We'll come back to more of the postmodern stuff a little bit later, because we are in one of those big shifts. We're in one of those shifts right now away from postmodernist sort of structures in education to whatever it's going to be. But it's, we're kind of swinging the pendulum away from postmodernist a little bit because of the structures of things. So have a good week. Do a little reading, find a little spot, occasionally do a little reading. And if you hit something that you don't quite understand or figure out, just go around it and read the next piece. And if you have questions, come back next week and let's deal with those questions first, and then we'll move on.
I have a question about the first analysis that we have due, because it's coming up in about 2 weeks. And so that one's going to be strictly on the structural analysis, the 2 questions that are in the syllabus about
Right.
the loose coupling and the characteristics of bureaucracy.
Yeah, and we'll get into both of those things next week.
Next week. Okay, so there'll be content next week. So it's not something we need to kind of research on our own. There'll be content next week for it.
No, it's in the content basis for next week.
Okay, thank you.
All right, folks. Is that it? Have a good evening and happy reading, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.